Okay, so what if you could solve all of modern society's problems with just one single comprehensive plan? Sounds impossible, right? Well, back in 1916, right at the peak of the industrial age, a writer and physician named Havelock Ellis, he tried to do exactly that. So let's dive into his incredibly ambitious book, The Task of Social Hygiene. It's basically a historical blueprint from the progressive era for fixing, well, pretty much everything by applying scientific principles to make society better. Right from the very start, Ellis makes it super clear this isn't some rigid top-down plan of control. He wasn't aiming for a sterile, orderly society. No, he was chasing a new kind of joy, a new freedom. This quote, it's really the key to understanding his whole motivation. So, where do you even begin a project this massive? For Ellis, the answer was pretty obvious. You start with the most visible problems of the time, all the chaos and decay that came with the Industrial Revolution. See, before this period, the guiding principle was laissez-faire, which basically means let it be. The whole idea was that individual effort was enough. But the shift to factory life, it just ripped people from their roots and crammed them into cities, creating a mess that no one person could possibly clean up. The old system was failing and, people were really suffering. What's really fascinating is how Ellis saw these social reforms as a logical progression. He kind of charted this clear path. You start with the external environment, right? Cleaning the streets, the sewers. Then you move indoors to regulate the factories. From there, the focus shifts to the individual citizen with national education that's not just about books, but about a child's total welfare. And finally, that care gets pushed all the way back to the very beginning of life with support for infants and mothers. It's this really deliberate march from the outside world inward. Building on all these reforms, Ellis identified what he believed was the true engine of social evolution, the changing status of women. For him, this was absolutely central to building a better society. Ellis had this really compelling theory about what he called the laws of attraction. He argued that out in nature, it's typically the female who chooses her mate, and that's what drives evolution. But in human society, he believed, economic dependence had totally flipped this natural order on its head. Women were often forced to compete for men because men held all the economic power. His core belief was that if women could gain economic independence, this natural balance of choice would finally be restored. And this brings us to his view on the militant suffrage movement of his day. See, he saw civilization's progress as this big shift away from what he called man's method of brute force, toward what he called woman's method of charm, reason and persuasion. He argued that when suffragettes used violence, they were actually regressing to savagery and undermining the very civilizing influence he believed women represented. All right, so this brings us to another part of his vision, and this one feels surprisingly modern. It's his skepticism about the government's ability to police our private lives. He asked this really fundamental question about the limits of the law. So, can a government actually legislate morality? Ellis was fascinated by this question, and by where a society should draw the line. I mean, what's the real difference between a private vice and a public crime? And who gets to decide? He actually looked at how different nations were tackling this very problem. To explore this, he contrasted two really different legal philosophies. In France, the general view was that the state should just stay out of private life. Social disapproval was punishment enough. But in Germany, the thinking was the complete opposite. If something is immoral, the state should make it illegal, even if that means the police are prying into people's private lives. You've got two powerful nations with two totally different answers to the same question. And for perfect example of this problem, he pointed right to prohibition in the United States. Get this, in a 1911 vote in Maine, a law banning alcohol was upheld by a tiny margin of just 700 votes out of 120,000. For Ellis, this proved his point perfectly. A law that barely has majority support and is actively opposed in all the major cities is just impossible to enforce. It doesn't reduce immorality, it just breeds contempt for the law itself. So all of these reforms, sanitation, women's rights, the limits of the law, they were all steps toward a final, ultimate goal. And this is where his vision becomes its most ambitious and, for sure, its most controversial, consciously shaping the future of humanity itself. The word for this was eugenics. Now, that is a word that carries an extremely heavy and negative weight today, so it's really crucial to understand what it meant to him in 1916. He defined it as a partnership with nature, basically aiding evolution to create better people, and in his words, purifying the race. This idea of purification was the logical endpoint of his entire project, moving from clean streets and healthy bodies to a genetically clean population. So this created a central tension in his philosophy. On one hand, you have all the social welfare reforms, what he called environmental socialism, aimed at helping everyone improve their lives. But Ellis saw a risk here, that by helping the weak, incompetent, and defective, as he termed them, society was enabling them to reproduce and pass on those traits. The solution, in his view, was what he called enlightened eugenics, which would consciously manage human breeding to improve the quality of the population, balancing out the perceived negative effects of social welfare. And that brings us to his final staggering thought. The ultimate task of social hygiene wasn't just to solve society's problems, but to first create the people who were capable of solving them. It's a vision that's both immensely optimistic about human potential and, at the same time, deeply troubling in its implications. And it leaves us asking, where is the line between improving society and controlling it?